Thank you very much. Today's session, cyber extortion, what can we really do about it? We're aiming with this call to give an indication of some practical steps that we can take to build cyber resilience against cyber extortion and ransomware. So this is actually part 3 in a series of webinars that we've been running. This is the session today, as I said, aimed to be talking about practical steps. But if you were with us for sessions 1 and 2, session number 1 2 weeks ago was looking at the challenge from an incident response perspective. And then last week with my colleague Grant Paling from product management, we were looking at threat intelligence and how having an understanding of the nature of the threat can help us to prepare our defenses to be the most contextually relevant as possible. And so, yeah, here's the concluding part 3. I'm your host today. My name's Dominic Trott. I'm Director of Strategy and Alliances here at Orange Cyberdefense in the UK. And Ross, let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Dom. Yes, so Ross Asquith, I'm a solutions architect at Halcyon, so I work on the technical teams, and I'm going to talk a little bit later on the webinar about Halcyon and also do a demonstration for you. So I look forward to that once Dom's finished.
Cracking. Thank you very much, Ross. So let's get into it. As I said, this is the third of a series, and I wanted to show you how, and as the concluding part, let's have a look at how these all fit together. So when Scott Walker, the head of our international CSIRT, Cybersecurity Incident Response Team, presented 2 weeks ago, as I said, he was looking at the incident response side of things. And you can see on the screen, here's Orange Cyberdefense's framework for how we structure the nature of how we help our clients to protect their critical assets against the threat landscape that they face. It might look a little bit familiar. It is modeled quite heavily on the NIST framework from the US Department of Commerce. We've updated and amended that slightly because I mentioned that point of threat intelligence. So we've added an anticipate phase in there, but hopefully the rest of that looks pretty familiar to you. And yes, so 2 weeks ago, the first installment of this series was looking at the respond tier. Then last week with Grant Paling, we moved on to anticipate. So therefore, with 3 phases of that outer circle of the model left, here we are in part 3. We're aiming to not only look at those identify, protect, and detect elements of the model, but actually show how the whole thing fits together. So in order to do this, we set out 4 things that we'd like to tackle. I'm going to start us off. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between security and resilience. So resilience is a bit of a buzzword that's very prominent in the marketplace and market communications today. I'm sure you can't have helped but notice, if only for the fact that it's a major element of the evolving security regulatory landscape as we go forwards, as well as I would suggest perhaps something to bear in mind in terms of best practice and in terms of how to manage and deal with the threat landscape. Before taking a step forward and looking at what are some practical steps that we can take to actually adopt more of a resilient approach in the way we go about cybersecurity and facing down the threat of ransomware. Before I then hand over Ross, who's going to take a look at the ransomware kill chain, the role of endpoint protection platforms and EDR, and a broader defense in depth approach to dealing with that challenge, and as well as a live demonstration of Halcyon's anti-ransomware detection technology. So on to point 1, what exactly is resilience? Well, here we have one of my favorite quotes that I think embody that quite nicely. Interesting how we often see boxing philosopher poets as coming out with quotes that are relevant for the cybersecurity industry. And here we have Rocky Balboa for his eponymous film from 2006. And within that, he said at one point, "It ain't about how hard you hit, it's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done." And to me, I think that sums up pretty nicely what we mean when we're talking about resilience. It's the ability to see an incident or even attack start to evolve, being able to contain that and yet still keep moving forwards with business as usual, deal with the threat, remediate, close that down, and get back to business as usual and more broadly, without the business falling down, and having the opportunity to then learn and improve off the back of that, so we don't have to face that challenge again next time. So if that's an idea of what is resilience, what exactly do we mean when we're talking about cyber resilience? Well, again, you don't have to just take my word for it. There are more learned colleagues within the organisation that have more to say. And here we have one of Orange Cyberdefence's security researchers. So Dr. Rick Derbyshire, who's based here in the UK, he's a principal security researcher looking in particular at OT and critical infrastructure. And he was getting vociferous about this topic on LinkedIn the other day. And I saw him write this statement here. Security and resilience aren't the same thing. One focuses on preventing attacks, the other on withstanding and recovering from them. Conflating them isn't just imprecise, it leads to mismatched expectations, especially in industrial environments. We can have resilient systems that aren't secure and secure systems that aren't resilient. So that's a sort of a fulsome quote, but I think it reminds us of a few different key points here. First of all, security and resilience aren't the same thing. Next, that security is about preventing attacks. And then, as I said with the Rocky quote, resilience is more about being able to deal with attacks. So withstanding their initial impact, rolling with the punches to be able to kind of recover from them, and then moving forward with business as usual. So if that's a bit of an insight into what we mean by cyber resilience, what are we going to do to start actually bearing in mind and embodying those principles? Well, again, you don't just have to take my word for it. So we can, I mentioned before, the fact that resilience is a kind of an ever more prominent piece of the regulatory landscape. So let's have a look at what at a very high summary level, what is the regulatory guidance out there? So if we look to the EU, where the NIS2 directive, so Network and Information Security Directive Part 2, is already in force. Here in the UK, we're not quite there yet with our updated regulatory landscape, but the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, due to publish later this year, is expected to be influenced, at least to some extent, by the EU's NIS2. So I think that's probably as good a model as any for us to start looking at and thinking about what we mean by cyber resilience. If I can make the slide advance, there we go. At the summary level, they think that, that resilience is moving beyond a mindset of pure compliance or taking a tick box exercise to do the kind of the bare minimum in order to kind of meet required standards and expectations, to then start actually building a culture of how we're going to go about resilience in how we go about our business as usual. So actively preparing ahead of incidents occurring, building capacity to withstand and recover, rather than simply responding passively as and when an incident may happen to occur. And that's a nice overall statement. They do go ahead and set out a cyber assessment framework that consists of 4 components in terms of starting to think, how do we go about this problem of acting in a resilient way? So first of all, managing security risks. So if you remember that circular model I shared at the beginning, in the center we had critical assets. So the name of the game is to protect those critical assets within your organization. And then there was a small circle around those critical assets at the heart of the model, talking about governance. So the idea of making sure that we're taking the correct steps to govern, manage risk, and including thinking about third-party risk as a first step in terms of how we can go about this problem. Moving on then, protecting against cyber attacks. So how can we combine policy, process, and technology in order to take steps to protect those critical assets within the organization? Moving on, detecting cybersecurity events. So as an incident starts to unfold, how are we going beyond just sort of managing devices to actually monitoring but proactively discovering events as they occur? And then the fourth point is minimizing the impact of cyber events. So thinking about the response and recovery planning when an incident should occur, and then going beyond that to applying lessons learned to improve business as usual going forwards after the event. And if that's the summary guidance, that's the regulatory perspective of what we ought to be doing. let's take a look about what Orange Cyberdefense is doing to help organizations apply cyber resilience. So again, here's that model I mentioned. This is how we view the approach that we have to helping our clients to protect themselves against the threat landscape, including, of course, cyber extortion and ransomware. If we work our way around that model, if we start with the topic from the first webinar in RCO3, respond, so we have their incident response advisory and an incident response itself. And if you were on that call, you'll remember that Scott talked us through the fact that being able to use technology to respond is one thing, but actually is just as important as having the right people and processes to make sure that you're, as per that cyber assessment framework, being proactive in how you ready yourself rather than just waiting for something to happen and responding passively. Moving on to the anticipate phase, so what we heard about last week with Grant, how we're applying threat intelligence and cybercrime management to make sure we're understanding the threat landscape and being able to adapt our mentality and our approach going forward as a result of the nature and context of the threat that we face. Before we then move on to the identify phase, so this is how we understand our attack surface, both internally and externally, using techniques such as pen testing, red teaming, and increasingly going forwards to take that proactive approach, exposure management, to take a more dynamic approach to how we're thinking about that attack surface. Protect, where classically we'd think about things like boundary controls, perimeter controls, like endpoint and network security, identity and access. Data backup and restore, that's absolutely vital when we're thinking about ransomware and the nature of that attack. But going forwards, not just frameworks like SASE and Zero Trust that aggregate a number of different controls into a framework basis, but actually the way we're seeing the opportunity to be more proactive going forwards is to think about these in terms of posture management, which you may see more and more of going forwards. And then finally, in the detect phase, the use of things like EDR and increasingly on a more platform basis, XDR, which comes alongside the more not just seen, but next generation log detection, and of course, proactive threat hunting. So if those are the elements within this model, I think it's important also to think about this in a life cycle kind of perspective. So it's all well and good thinking about each of those pillars in isolation, but the opportunity is to be more cyber resilient, is to think about how this works as a kind of a virtuous cycle. So if we start around that wheel again, in the case of an incident, if we have to respond to an incident, then we can use that as an opportunity to adjust the way we're going about things. Using the anticipate pillar and thinking about threat intelligence, we can plan for how we might go about defending ourselves against an attack that might happen in the future. The identify pillar would help us to work out where any kind of weaknesses and vulnerabilities might exist so that we can start to implement the right technologies and processes in the protect phase. When we are then moving into detect, we'll start to monitor what those detections look like, so that if we then start moving into another respond phase, we can adapt as we move. So it's a case of blocking incidents as they occur, rather than having to wait until they actually land and have a negative impact before we respond. And I would also stress that as well as operating in that life cycle basis in terms of the various pillars of the framework, it's also important to bear in mind, as Scott was talking about 2 weeks ago, the importance of not just technology, but also people and process as part of that holy trinity of how we manage that. It's all well and good having the best technologies, but if you don't have the right people who understand how to make use of them, or the right process that tells you about how to enable and enact those at the right times, it's not necessarily going to help you to the extent that you require. Moving on then, connecting this idea of resilience with ransomware. So I had the pleasure of attending the RSA conference over in San Francisco over this year, and whilst I was there, I managed to catch a fireside chat featuring Anne Keys-Butler, who's the director of GCHQ. She was having a chat with the former director of cyber in the US, and a really interesting quote I thought was appropriate for today's session. Anne said, the biggest threat right now is from ransomware. Ransomware itself is small and can be simple to execute, but with big potential impact. So if we defend against ransomware, that may also protect us against vulnerability to the most sophisticated state threats. So recognizing that while you can indeed have ransomware attacks propagated by script kiddies in effect, or people of relatively limited scale and experience, but with access to potentially more advanced tools, are able to affect attacks that can have significant impacts. And as we've seen with some of the scattered spider attacks, for example, have been particularly prominent in the news cycle lately, with a number of ransomware attacks across major UK retailers, we can see how the readiness from a resilience perspective can have varied effects. So you'll see some at the kind of the perhaps the less mature end of the scale weren't able to identify those attacks as they emerged, and or weren't able to start to enact their protections against them until it was too late. Whereas those that perhaps had a more of a resilient mindset were able to detect those attacks as they were emerging and were able to pull the plug sooner rather than later. So you have some that were able, yes, they've suffered perhaps for a few days, but were able to pull the plug, contain and get back to business as usual sooner, rather than those that perhaps unfortunately didn't notice until it's too late and are now facing costs of hundreds of millions of pounds as a result. And just to move forwards to wrapping up the first half of this session, I just wanted to show, based on Orange Cyberdefence's Security Navigator report that draws upon our threat research, our breach and intelligence and dark web monitoring. We put out a kind of our breach report on an annual basis. One of the key features within that is our set of data we have on the cyber extortion landscape. So if you're watching last week's session with Grant, you'll have seen a much deeper dive in terms of what this looks like on a global basis and some of the patterns over time and some of the reasons behind that. I was going to, just for the purposes of today, dig a little bit deeper just on the UK. And I can say that we have visibility of something like 200 incidents in the UK last year, bearing in mind that that has grown at a compound annual growth rate, or CAGR, of 25% over the past 4 years or so that we've been publishing this information. So a relatively significant volume, and that's just what we can see. That won't include, for example, those where a ransomware attack began but it was blocked, or those that paid the ransom and covered it up. This is based on what we can see, so it's not the total number of ransomware attacks that happened, but yes, that number is growing fast, and also positioning the UK amongst its geographical peers. We can see that it's the third most impacted country globally. This chart here on the top right, that's not just many more attacks that happen within the US than anywhere else, that it would be kind of meaningful to look at a chart that looks like that. But yes, after the US, which is by far and away the leader, you then have Canada, which perhaps due to kind of language commonality and geographical proximity follows. And then hot on Canada's heels, you have UK, which is significantly ahead of Germany and France. And then thinking about the type of industries that are affected by ransomware, bear in mind, if you've got professional, scientific and technical services, the #1 most impacted vertical, with 19% of those incidents in 2024, followed closely by manufacturing, which obviously has a number of highly IP-related sectors. When a kind of a ransomware attack happens, and also thinking about this as not just a single extortion, so demanding a ransom in order to kind of return access to your data and your encryption keys, on a double extortion basis, where they're threatening to leak your critical assets, your sensitive data onto the dark web, those heavily IP-oriented markets, that's a significant extra risk that we're talking about here. But also, if we look at 3, 4, and 5 on the list here, whether it's major wholesalers or indeed education, possibly down to the level of a single school, it doesn't matter if you're a big or large organization, ransomware is something that can affect your organization. So with that, I think I've set us up for the session. So Ross, let me pass over to you to think about the kill chain from an attack chain perspective.
Thank you very much, Dom. Let me share out my screen. Is that working already? Do you see the slides, Dom?
Not yet.
Okay, what's not working there? Let me retry that. My screen. Well, it says it's showing my screen.
Oh, I can see it coming up now. Here we go. That's visible.
Okay, I was just trying to, sorry, get rid of the GoToMeeting controls now, they're in the way. So let me take it from here. Thank you, Dom. So yes, we want to drill down a little bit now into the specifics of a ransomware attack. And I think too often, perhaps when we talk about ransomware, we immediately think of the end result of the ransomware attack, which is the encryption of people's data, perhaps the theft of an organization's data. But of course, there is many stages before those that are part of a ransomware attack, which are opportunities to disrupt it, to prevent the attack. And that's what we're going to talk about today, and how we can perhaps do that. So this is a very typical representation of that attack chain, from initial access into the environment right through to perhaps data encryption on the right-hand side. And as I say, every one of these steps is an opportunity where we could disrupt the attack. And many of the controls that organizations have to, I don't know, prevent phishing, or to stop social engineering, to protect their perimeter and so on. These are steps that we take to ultimately protect our environment from compromise, right? And that's what we're talking about in this left-hand side. Now, there are lots of reasons why someone might want to compromise your environment, and there have been lots of reasons over the years why someone would want to do that. Today, if an attacker is looking to monetize that exercise, generally they will compromise the environment and then launch some form of ransomware, because by extorting you as an organization, they can obviously make good money, and we know it's an extremely profitable type of cyber threat. So what's Halcyon looking to do as we move towards perhaps talking about a solution to this problem? Well, Halcyon, as I've hinted at, is looking to disrupt a ransomware attack at any of these possible stages. So whether it's the escalation of the privileges that the threat actor has within the environment, or the enumeration of the environment to explore it and understand it better, right through to the possibility that they might try and exfiltrate data or encrypt your files. So we're going to take a look in the demonstration in a moment at how we complement your existing controls, because you will undoubtedly have some form of ransomware resilience, typically in the form of EDRs or endpoint protection, right through to backups, which provide resilience again against that encryption phase. But we're going to take a look in a demo at that. Before we do it, I'll just put this in some context, and I hope this isn't too small to read on your screens. But this was a little bit of research that our own internal threat teams did to kind of map Scattered Spider, one of the most kind of well-known now affiliate groups that obviously was responsible for some of the recent retail attacks in the UK, to map some of their tactics and their procedures and techniques against this attack chain. And there's some interesting points on here that maybe I'll just pull out. Firstly, when it comes to the tools that these affiliate groups are using to compromise the environment, they are extremely numerous, right? So you'll see here under remote monitoring and management tools, which includes the kind of remote access into environments, we saw hundreds of different tools being used. And obviously, sometimes these attackers will use the same tools that they know that organization is using, because they know they can hide in amongst the legitimate usage there. We also see them using what we might call living off the land tooling, things like Nmap or various IP scanners and so on, to enumerate and explore the environment. And these tools in themselves obviously aren't designed to be used maliciously, but nonetheless, when they are used in the environment by a threat actor, that's exactly what they are, right? We also see a couple of things over on the right-hand side that I think are interesting. The exfiltration of data doesn't necessarily focus on your most sensitive customer data or PII or PCI data. We can see here, top of the list for data exfiltration, from a Scattered Spider perspective, your IT documentation, right, to help them understand your environment and more fully compromise it, or perhaps to let them understand it well enough that they can regain access if you manage to evict them from the environment on this occasion. And my last interesting point about ScatterSpider was their use of the ransomware encryption payloads from ransomware as a service organizations, but they're not tying themselves to just one. So we know that DragonForce was used as part of the recent attacks, but we've seen ScatterSpider also be an affiliate of Quillin and of Play, which are other ransomware as a service groups. So they seem to choose which group they're using. We don't obviously know exactly why they're doing that right now. It could be a monetary thing, and they might get a greater cut of the ransom payment, or it could be a technical reason. But interesting, because that is a little bit unusual. Normally we see these threat affiliate groups, use buddying up with one of these ransomware as a service providers. So, as Dom said at the start, please do submit any questions. If there's any questions about anything I showed just now, please drop them into the question box. We'll pick them up at the end. But before we get to that stage, I'm going to do a quick demonstration for you of Halcyon and how we can help to disrupt ransomware when it tries to attack your environment or any other environment. And so without further ado, let me switch to my demo environment. And maybe I'll just check with Dom that screen share is working okay.
Yeah, I can see your login page for the Halcyon.
Brilliant. Okay, awesome. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to look at the kind of console end of things. Don't worry, I'm not going to turn this into a training course. But what I want to show here is that Halcyon is a SaaS-based platform. So we're trying to keep things as simple as possible. So there is a cloud-based backend and a cloud-based UI that you use to manage our tool. And what we see here is in my demo environment, the assets that I have registered and therefore protected by Halcyon. So each of these Windows machines, and you see mostly endpoint machines here, are running our Halcyon agent. And that Halcyon agent, a bit like an EDR agent, is monitoring any activity on that machine, any processes that launch, any executables that try to load, and obviously puts us in a position to be able to make decisions as to whether these things are good or bad. Now, it also puts us in a position to observe very suspicious behaviors or malicious behaviors like exfiltration or encryption. And I'm going to show you specifically around encryption how Halcyon could help with the recovery from an encrypting ransomware event should it happen in your environment. So we're starting at the kind of far end of the kill chain that we looked at a moment ago, and looking at some pretty unique capability here to help you out of a difficult situation. So here's my endpoint machine running the Halcyon agent. You can see our little sunset icon in the corner, hopefully, if it's not too small. And the deployment of Halcyon onto this machine was done remotely. So it's a simple push the installer, transparent install, really simple, really lightweight agent. And one of the things that agent is doing is it's monitoring this machine for any processes that perform cryptographic activity. And of course, if I have a ransomware encryptor, and it just so happens I do have one, like this, that runs on this machine, it's going to perform cryptographic activities because it needs to encrypt, or it wants to encrypt the files on this machine. So this encryptor I've purposefully allowed in my policy because ordinarily Halcyon is going to prevent things like this from running. But in order to observe this behavior of encryption and then show how Halcyon can help recover from that, I've allowed it to run. And just to prove to you that it is going to legitimately encrypt this machine, I also have some clear text files on this machine. You can see here that I've opened in Notepad. And before I run the encryptor, I'm going to give you a sneak peek behind the scenes of what our agent is doing. And I'm going to do that by running a little script in this window that's going to show you what the Halcyon agent is doing in the background. All will become clear. So let me launch this ransomware encryptor on this machine. We're assuming at this point that it has bypassed our other controls, right? It's got past the EDR, or the EDR has been disabled, and it's got past Halcyon's preventative measures and got to the point where it's able to execute. And so in this situation, once encryption is completed, as is very common, we get a splash screen with information about how to communicate or contact the ransomware group. But obviously the main harm of that encryptor is that the files that we looked at a moment ago in my documents directory have now been changed. They've been given a new extension. And if I try and open any of these files, we're going to see that, they're not readable anymore. This isn't the text that was there before. They've been encrypted by this encrypting software. So what's unique about this machine? Well, because it's got Halcyon installed on it, and because we were looking out for cryptographic activity, we have managed to capture the cryptographic details of this process. So you'll see in my logs down here, again, hopefully you can read it okay, we see something called a key extraction event, and we are specifically seeing some random numbers being generated cryptographically. Now this process, when it runs, uses those random numbers to run through an algorithm and generate keys that are used to encrypt these files. What does it mean for us to have captured that random number data? Well, it means that if we know the algorithm that this encryptor is using, then we can use that random number to generate the same keys. And so if you've got the same keys, I can decrypt the files, right? And that's exactly what Halcyon's services team are able to do. So our reverse engineers will dismantle the encryptor, figure out how it works, what algorithm it uses, and then use that information to build a decryptor of our own. So there's no need to get a decryptor from a ransomware group, and there's no need to pay the ransomware group to get your keys, because Halcyon has both of those things for you already. The keys have been captured, or the random numbers have been captured, and the decryptor is fully functional. So if I run this decryptor on this machine, it pulls those random numbers out of secure storage, it runs them through the algorithm, and it generates keys that we can apply to these files, and I can put those files back exactly as they were moments before they were encrypted. Now, this, of course, may not be the only way to recover from the situation you find yourself in. You may decide to go down the route of dealing with the ransomware group and hopefully recovering that way. Maybe that's your only option. Or you may feel that your backups are your best strategy and you can go to those. So Halcyon isn't necessarily looking to replace those two options. Well, maybe we're looking to replace talking to a ransomware group, because I don't think we'd ever recommend that. But we want to provide another option in the worst case scenario. So it's about layers of defense, extra layers of resilience. And so hopefully that was an interesting demonstration. It's normally what piques people's interest in the Halcyon solution, our ability to decrypt in that way, should it be necessary. But of course, we don't really want to let our customers get into that situation. We want to detect the activity of a ransomware affiliate group or attacker within the environment before it gets to the point of encryption. So let's take a look at some of the more preventative measures or detective measures that we have for things like data exfiltration. So here's a tool that's designed to exfiltrate data off this machine and out to the internet. It's, again, very common, very similar kind of tools that are used by ransomware groups. And I'm going to run this at the command line. It's been allowed to run. Again, I've whitelisted it. Normally my policy would block tools like this if we'd seen them before. But in this case, it runs, it finds some files of interest on this system, it puts them into a zip file, a compressed folder, and it tries to upload them to Mega. And Mega is one of those file storage SaaS platforms on the internet, and there's a whole bunch of those types of tools that are used by ransomware groups. And so, because we're monitoring all processes running on the machine, including this one, we can take a look at its behavior, and we could say and detect and alert you to the fact that a particular process running on the machine is trying to move data to this known bad destination, in this case, a nefarious peer like Mega. And you see here a warning coming up in our console saying that we're seeing data exfiltration to this location. The other type of data exfiltration we might see, and I have an example of it here historically, is not necessarily to a bad destination, but just an unusually large amount of data moving somewhere on the internet. So this is less about the destination that we see data going to and more about just a suspicious volume. So in this case, if I were to drill down into this alert, we can see that my threshold was set at just 100 meg or 0.1 of a gig. And when this particular app, whatever it was, moved more than that amount of data, it triggered an alert from Halcyon that we raised to your security team. And you can obviously react to that in any way you like. You could automate a response, or you could manually investigate what's happening in that situation. Now, identifying the behavior of an attacker in the environment, excuse me one second. Frog in my throat, that's better. So in addition to just warning you of these types of behaviors, obviously there are circumstances where the confidence can be much higher that something malicious is happening. And we see some examples in our list here of malicious executables trying to launch on this machine. And again, this suggests that the EDR has failed to detect, excuse me, failed to detect or has been disabled, which is very common as part of a ransomware attack. And it means that, you know, we need another line of defense, and that's exactly what Halcyon is trying to provide, right? We're not there to replace the EDR, we're there to back it up in case it fails, it misses, or it's shut down as part of the attack, because we know that all good security strategies are based on layers. We know the term defense in depth. So in this case, you know, we would pick up on, you know, the lockbit payload, or I also have some other payloads historically here, things like Medusa and so on, well-known ransomware that we've identified previously, that we continuously evaluate new samples of and continue to be able to block. Sometimes, particularly novel or advanced threats, you know, we might not know about in advance, and those may need to be detected based on their behavior. So we see a few alerts in here for bad behavior, where we are actually detecting that one particular executable was launched and then it's conducted some bad behavior in the following alerts here, including using a system tool, in this case like VSS admin. And VSS admin is used to manage the recovery snapshots on any Windows endpoint. And what we can actually see here, again, apologies if it's very small, is VSS admin being used to try and quietly delete the recovery snapshots on a machine. Now, any executable process that tries to do that is clearly up to no good. And actually, it's a very common indicator, a behavioral indicator of ransomware, together with executables that try and tamper with the startup of Windows or use PowerShell to perform various nefarious activities. So these types of detections allow us to put in place these additional layers of protection against ransomware, solely focused on ransomware TTPs. So we're not going to get you know, confused by other malicious activities. That's the job of the EDR. We're just there, as I say, to focus, laser focus on ransomware. Halcyon also, because we acknowledge that, you know, ransomware isn't always just a technology threat. There will often be a person, you know, with persistent remote access into the environment, you know, navigating that environment, launching these payloads, further exploring the environment and so on. We feel that the best way to deal with a human element of an attack like that is with a human response. So as part of Halcyon's offering, we're not just technology, so we're not just an agent on an endpoint. We are also a service that monitors and reacts to any of the alerts that we see within our customer environments, just like those that you see here. And together with our partners like Orange, we can obviously provide an incident response whenever something happens. So you may not be a ransomware expert, you may be deeply troubled by the incident you find yourself in, but you can rest assured that you have us and OCD who backing you up to deal with that scenario. And in the worst case, it will be us helping to provide that recovery assistance. But even well before that, we can provide information about what we're seeing. We can help you understand what the tooling actions we're seeing, what that might mean, what threat actor that might be, and how best to try and get that threat actor out of your environment. So it is about technology, but it's also about human response as well, and that's something we're super pleased to be able to offer to all our customers. So I'm going to wind up there. I think that's probably enough without turning this into a training course, but hopefully you've seen some things there that help you understand how Halcyon can prevent ransomware, detect ransomware, help you recover from ransomware, and basically add additional layers to your strategy for adding ransomware resilience in your organization. So thanks for your time. I look forward to questions, and I think I'm going to hand back to Dom now.
Yeah, super. Thank you very much, Ross. And I'll just reiterate a point you made there. Halcyon is one of our newest and I think most exciting partners that we're working together with here at Orange Cyberdefense. So we are actively working to help embed for our customers Halcyon's defense in depth technology, your incident response services specifically for ransomware, and wrap around them our broader incident response services, as well as things like our pen testing, our threat intelligence, detection response, etc., to offer that full life cycle support. So I'm really pleased to be working together with Halcyon and to be with you today on this webinar, Ross. But if we could move on to the next piece, I thought it would be a good idea just to kind of cover off the key takeaway points that we went over. So I'll start us off with the first half. So I was focusing on cyber resilience. So that's the key here, is to make sure that we're able to withstand and recover from attacks, even if we can't prevent them outright, so we can respond and learn and improve going forwards without the business falling over. And secondly, thinking about how this requires an end-to-end and life cycle approach to get that goal of learning from threats and incidents and adopting our approach going forwards. So Ross, if you want to take your 2 points.
Yeah, I thought I'd just hammer home these 2 points, that there is no silver bullet. There's no silver bullet for ransomware, just like there's no silver bullet for any threat, really. No resilience layer is ever 100%, so including Halcyon, right? So it's just about putting more barriers up where possible to defend against ransomware. And defending against ransomware, it's a cat and mouse game or an arms race, phrase it how you like. We can never get ahead of what those attackers are doing because we never know what their next move might be. But obviously we can stay as close behind as we can. So, your response to ransomware does need to adapt because they are changing their strategy extremely quickly. They're well funded and well motivated to do that.
Superb, thank you, Ross. And just to close off as a kind of a call for action, this is the concluding piece in our Challenger series of webinars looking at the problem of ransomware. But if you want to keep on hearing more from us, we have recently started our Safer Digital Society podcast series. If you use the QR code here, you'll be able to click through and subscribe to that. I think that's just the right combination of informative and fun. Some of our top practitioners, so the aforementioned Scott Walker, head of our international cybersecurity incident response team, as well as Stu Kennedy, who heads up our UK pen testing team. They're great guys, really proficient in terms of not only their technical understanding, but being able to explain that to kind of not a non-technical audience as well as a technical audience. So well worth signing up for that. And with that, I think that's through to the kind of the end of our piece. I think we've just got time for one question, and the number one question I can see in the chat here is, if you could recommend one step, beg your pardon, for resilience against ransomware, what would it be? If I were being flippant, I might say have a word with Orange Cyberdefense, how we can work with Halcyon to have that life cycle approach and defense in depth to ransomware resilience. But if I were more serious, I might say, I mentioned Anne-Keith Butler from GCHQ earlier. Obviously an agency within GCHQ is NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Centre. I would say go to those guys as a sort of impartial single point of information for UK cyber. Have a look at who are the right partners that are government approved that you can work with for things like incident response, detection, other capabilities, as well as information for kind of sharing with a non-technical audience. So what's the right guidance for making directors and board directors aware of the challenge, so that you can help to communicate the kind of the business risk of technical issues. So I would go down the sort of awareness, understanding, and kind of the comfort factor of a impartial national organisation that's giving recommendations of who you might want to work with and what you might want to do to raise that. But Ross, is there anything that you'd look to add to that?
Well, I guess if I'm being forced to name a single step, having made the point that there's no silver bullet, it seems to me like so often the ransomware story or ransomware event within an organization begins with that initial access, right? And people not having multi-factor authentication, the human element, the social, the kind of social compromise, as it were, of a person or their account. And so I think, that's the earliest opportunity pretty much that you have to stop a ransomware attack. And so, just make sure that multi-factor authentication is there for your users, especially your privileged users, but also, your supply chain and partners and so on. I feel like if we really nailed that as between us as organizations, we'd be doing a good job to defend against ransomware. So yeah, that would be my thought on it, if I'm honest.
Super. And with that, I think we're precisely on time. So thank you very much for joining me today, Ross. It's been a pleasure to speak with you and to our audience. To the audience, I'd say thank you very much for taking the time to join us. It's been a pleasure. If you do have any further questions, please don't hesitate to speak to your Orange Cyberdefense account manager. With that, wishing you the best for the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.